In this episode of Locked On Capitals, I am joined by Corey Swartz as we talk about the Hershey Bears. What players on the Hershey Bears are slated to make their big slot on the Washington Capitals? And who is going to be on the Washington Capitals in net? Do they have someone in Hershey that could fill that role? We'll talk about all of that and more next on this edition of Locked On Capitals.
Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals. I'm so glad you decided to join me today. As always, this podcast is free and available on all the major platforms, and I want to thank you for making this your first listen or view of the day. Yes, this podcast is also available in video form, so head on over to YouTube and check that out. My name is Dan Holme. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. So in this edition, I am joined by Corey Swartz of the Hershey Bears Hockey Nation. It's a blog that talks primarily about the Hershey Bears. Corey, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about your blog.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate you having me on. My blog is Bears Hockey Nation. I cover, variety of things, game day, previews, do a lot of stuff over the summer here talking about, where the Bears and the Caps are going from here. Do a lot of things, free agency, the draft. We basically try to cover all things that if you want to see what's going on today with the Hershey Bears, it's your one-stop place for it, for sure.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us. So you could say that the Hershey Bears and the Washington Capitals, they didn't get the outcome that they were looking for this season. The Washington Capitals made another first-round exit, and some of the issues that were kind of glaring was the netminding situation. Ilya Samsonov and Vitek Vanacek, kind of the youngest tandem in the NHL, kind of an unproven commodity. They weren't enough when the rubber met the road. My question for you is that Vitek Vanacek and Ilya Samsonov are both RFAs. So for some strange reason, say both of them walk, which seems highly unlikely, but say it happens. Is there someone in Hershey that's ready to take over that role as a number two netminder? I ultimately think they'll go outside of the organization and get that number one netminder. Who do they have in Hershey that could take over that number two spot?
Well, I do agree with you that ultimately I think Washington's going to look externally for a position like that. They talked a number of times about, wanting to get that veteran presence, but they do have goaltenders in Hershey that I think could come up and do an admirable job. I mean, most notably, we've seen him a couple of times here. Zach Fucale, I think, is a guy that when he's hot, he could be a great second goaltender. Not the guy that carries, half and half as Samsonov and Vanacek did this past season, but he's certainly a guy who, we saw him step in and, deliver a shutout in memorable fashion last season. He's got a lot of the great, skills. It was kind of an up and down year for him this past season, but, when he's dialed in, he is one of the best goaltenders you can find. It's been a steal of a find by the Washington Capitals down in Hershey so far. Looking for a really big year for him and coming up in his third season, second full in Hershey, and I think they're going to be turning to Hunter Shepard in goal here to carry a lot of the weight here as well. When he's been in Hershey, which wasn't a ton, these last couple of seasons, only a handful of games, the Bears and Caps pipeline has been incredibly well stacked here, I think. Those two goaltenders have been, Phoenix Copley and Hunter Shepard carried the real weight of it, but Shepard, to his credit, when he stepped in, was phenomenal. Had a pretty good year despite a lot of struggles down in South Carolina, I think. Definitely a guy that I think the organization is looking to see what he can do coming in on the second year of an NHL deal, I believe, for him. So, there's a lot of great guys, and, there's even great guys that are coming into the system this year that are probably going to be, ECHL mainstays, but lots to be excited about, I think, in the Caps goaltending pipeline as it develops here. Like I said, I don't think this is a next year maybe even year after type of situation. But there's a lot of guys that will be stepping up, I think, in the future for them for sure.
So let's talk about Phoenix Copley. Phoenix Copley is a name that's familiar to most any Washington Capitals fan. He was Braden Holtby's backup there. Where do you think he stands with the Washington Capitals and the Hershey Bears? It's got to be kind of tough spot for these netminders that have spent so much time in the AHL. They got to be kind of asking themselves to a certain point, do I have a job here somewhere? What are your thoughts on Phoenix Copley? You cover this team far more than I do. Do you think that Phoenix Copley still has it? My thoughts on it is even if he can find a spot in the Washington Capitals, I would love for him to finally get rewarded and get a job somewhere in the NHL. What are your thoughts on Phoenix Copley?
I love Cops. You can't say enough good things about him, honestly. I mean, I think back to when he earned his 100th professional win during the 2020-2021 season. Spencer Carberry, who was the coach at the time and is now, over in Toronto, he went on this, long, tangent about how great of a guy and how great and well prepared Phoenix Copley is. I'd love to go back and re-listen to the full quote. I remember him saying that he's one of the most mentally sound goaltenders you'll ever see. He doesn't question his situation. He doesn't, he's not trying to be any more than he is day to day. He comes in and he works hard and gives it his all, and it shows. I mean, him and Zach Fucale have been one of the league's top tandems of goaltenders for the last couple of seasons, and for Copley, he was the Bears starter for a reason. I mean, he earned that position and earned that right, I think, a lot of ways, in a sense, after going through some struggles and, seeing himself moved from, Braden Holtby's understudy, as you mentioned earlier, to, coming back to Hershey after Samsonov and Vanacek, kind of took the reins there in a lot of ways. And, has just been an absolute professional. I know everybody in Hershey really loves him. I know he's unrestricted this season or this summer coming up here. And, with the amount of goaltenders in the pipeline, it's hard to say where the future is for him in a lot of ways, if the Capitals will keep him on or, if they really want to let, seemingly Hunter Shepard have the reins here. It's hard to say. I mean, we really won't know until free agency hits and a decision's made there. Honestly, I'd love to see him come back. One of my favorite guys to watch in Hershey is he's been here for, a number of years and one of the longest tenured guys I can think of in terms of, amount of years and length of time here. And hey, we go back to 2016-17 a lot. I think if Copley doesn't get hurt back then in the Providence series, Hershey very well could have won a Calder Cup that season. He was that big and that important to the Bears back then. He's been that important to us for a long time. So I love him. I really like to see him get a shot in the NHL somewhere. I know goaltending positions are, of course, at a premium right now. Lots of goaltenders, guys are in situations like Washington where they want to have that veteran guy or that veteran answer. But, Copley's a guy that's earned it in my mind for sure to get that opportunity.
Yeah, it just seems kind of unfortunate. It seemed like he got kind of lost in the shuffle there when he was Braden Holtby's backup, and then Philip Grubauer was in there, and it just seemed like he kind of disappeared from the limelight. So that's the way that I'm looking at it. Is ultimately I am pro Phoenix Copley, and whether it's on the Washington Capitals or another team, I wish him nothing but the best. But the Hershey Bears have a long history of having really great goaltending. If you think of Michael Neuwirth and Braden Holtby, they just always seem to have a really good knack for picking good goaltenders. Another netminder that they signed was Clay Stevenson, I believe is his name. Do you know much about him? I know that they signed him, a few months ago. He's another prospect that is in the Washington Capitals pipeline. Where do the Capitals stand with him?
It's interesting you say that because it was kind of a surprise pickup in a sense where it was one of those out of the college ranks that, the Capitals seem to really pursue. And, in my mind, with the amount of goaltenders in the pipeline, I like to see him get a kind of shot, just kind of like how Hunter Shepard has been. I think that, Shepard and Fucale have earned the right to be the 1-2 tandem if Copley indeed, moves on and the Capitals don't pursue him and he doesn't come back to Hershey. But Stevenson, in my mind, is going to be the first call-up guy, most likely, if that ends up being the case. And, the Capitals have a very interesting situation. They currently have 6 goaltenders, 2 RFAs, and, 4 guys in the depth line alongside, I think it's Gavin Bjorklund's the other goaltender Washington signed earlier this before the season ended. all four of those guys are going to be guys that are going to be competing for time. There's going to be no shortage of, opportunity in that respect. And it's rare that it's that deep. But, as you said earlier, I think Alex Westland does a great job with all the goaltenders in Washington's system. He's probably helped the reason for a lot of these guys, Shepard, Fucale, Copley, dating back to a number of the guys even you mentioned. He's been here for a long time, and he's been a great reason towards Hershey and Washington enjoying so much goaltending success over the years, for sure.
All right, so we're coming up on the end of the segment here. I want your reaction. Which netminder should the Washington Capitals go with going forward? Should they go with Ilya Samsonov or Vitek Vanacek if they have to pick one? Because I think that ultimately that's what they're going to do. I don't think they'll have both of them come back. Who do you think they should go with?
Oh, man, this is such a hard question for me because I love both of those guys so much. They were our tandem back in the 2018-19 season when the Bears, bounced back to beat the Bridgeport Sound Tigers in the first round back then. And, I love them both. I honestly think that it's probably going to be Ilya Samsonov. I think he showed more flashes of being that goaltender they picked. Anytime you pick a goaltender as high as Ilya Samsonov did in the draft, you want to see his development through as long as you can. And, Vitek Vanacek, they could easily, I think it's a coin flip, honestly. You could either go easily either of those two guys, as they've both shown flashes. And, in my mind, for a long time, Vitek Vanacek was the stronger of the two of them at times. But, I think Samsonov's really coming around, and I just don't see them take a chance on seeing Samsonov oppose them someday and, become like how other goaltenders have, moved on from their initial team and, really turned their careers around, in the vein of like the Sergei Bobrovskys and goaltenders along those lines as well, for sure.
Yeah, one of the things that J.J. Regan said that was interesting is he said, just because Ilya Samsonov is having a rough go of it at this particular time doesn't mean that Vitek Vanacek is a starter in the NHL. It's just kind of the lesser of two evils. So, all right. So after the break here, we are going to talk about two big players in the Hershey Bears organization, two prospects, if you will. We'll talk about that after the break. BetOnline.net is the number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. Find all of the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's NHL playoffs and Major League Baseball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and more. And betonline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. Betonline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite teams and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, welcome back to this edition of Locked On Capitals. I am joined with Corey Swartz, and we're talking a little Hershey Bears hockey today, and two players that I'm really, really excited about. I was reading your article. I've heard them around the Washington Capitals organization, is Bear Hughes and Benton Maass. Bear Hughes, forward, a center, and Benton Maass is a defenseman. Why don't you tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about those two players?
Yeah, absolutely. So Bear Hughes and Benton Maass. Maass made his AHL debut at tail end of the season for the Bears as an amateur tryout, but both of them were former Capitals draft picks. Turning professional. Their junior careers are behind them here. In the minors, I believe Maass was a college signing. As I go back on it here a little bit, and Hughes obviously played in the Canadian Hockey League there, so in their ranks as well. And both of them, surprisingly, were not signed by the Capitals. Instead, were signed to AHL contracts by the Bears, which I found a little fascinating. I think both of them have great potential. I mean, Bear Hughes, he made a really good push to become captain of the Spokane Chiefs halfway through their season here in juniors. Really smart, really effective guy down low. He scores a lot of goals for, he really stepped up. He earned the captaincy, as we said earlier. Just a lot to be excited about. I think he has a lot of potential. He's grown fast, and that includes a detour down in the COVID season where, unfortunately, some of the junior leagues were impacted and weren't able to have their seasons. And Benton Maass, I mean, he looked great. I mean, I've seen some college clips of him blocking some shots. There's some great clips on YouTube of him absolutely selling out to make some big plays, with or without a stick. He seems to be the guy that, is willing to lay it all on the line, and, he can hurt you in a variety of ways. And it was impressive to me, especially, I mean, I know it's a 1-game end of the season type of sample size we're looking at, but when he made his debut there, they were playing the Syracuse Crunch, one of the tougher teams in the AHL. Down a couple of key guys, Lucas Johansson and Cody Franson both missed that game, if I remember correctly. And, Benton Maass steps in there, and he really, I know he, finished with an even stat line, but he did not look out of place there in the slightest. He looked very comfortable, just as good for a defenseman as you'd want to see in his first AHL game. So it was to me, I was thinking to myself, I hope they really bring this guy on and give him a chance. I'd like to see him get a look as, a depth defenseman, or potentially even more for the Bears here next season. So I'm excited to see what he brings, especially with some changes on the blue line here, especially with Alex Alexeyev looking like he's going to miss the start of the season after that surgery. It intrigues me to see who the organization really has in mind to take on that extra ice time, at least in his absence, because Alexeyev is just such a key player. I know there's a lot of chatter about him not getting quite his offensive numbers, but he is a rock back there for the Bears, and, really think he's going to be making his NHL debut sooner rather than later, for sure.
Yeah, so it's always exciting to see this new blood, these future players, as we can talk about this. Washington Capitals team is one of the oldest rosters in the NHL, and Bear Hughes, this was from Elite Prospects. The most exciting part of Bear's game is that he's a bear on the puck. Strength allows him to win battles from disadvantaged positions and shrug off checks. He keeps the puck across the hips, putting weight over the stick and making him tricky. With pressure bearing down, he integrates look-offs and changes of pace to misdirect defenders. So kind of some really great accolades for Bear Hughes. How far away do you think we are from these players being, contenders in the NHL? I know they're still a ways away, but if I'm asking you your thoughts on it, how many years away do you think we are from seeing a Bear Hughes in the NHL Washington Capitals organization playing on the big team?
Well, I mean, I think it could be sooner rather than later. I know he got his first taste of, playing in Capitals development camp prior to the start of last season. And I remember reading that his big takeaway was that he wanted to get bigger and add some size and, add a little bit more to his game, and just how skilled and, excellent those guys are in that camp. And I think it'll take him some time. I mean, you may be looking at a player kind of like Nathan Walker in a sense, is, kind of a guy that comes to mind in comparison, where it took Walker a good couple of years down in Hershey and really elevating his play and his role while he was down in Hershey there. I mean, he went from kind of being on the outside looking in to getting drafted by the Capitals, to, becoming a really key player, 2015, 16, 16, 17, and then leading up to making his debut in the NHL there a bit. And, we know how it went. He had that key assist in Game 6 against Pittsburgh, being inserted in the lineup there for the first time. I could picture it being a story similar to that, where, he's seems like he has all the makings to be a beloved player in Hershey, and, one of those guys where, I mean, how perfect is it to have a guy named Bear Hughes being a Hershey Bear? I mean, the script just writes itself. So, I think it's going to be sooner rather than later, and I think the Capitals are going to have their eye on him to, step up. And it's one of those players where I think it's one of the most exciting potential ads the Bears could have this summer, possibly. And it's one of those guys I'm going to be keeping an eye on him big time all season long.
Yeah, it's just exciting to see about that because, as time goes on, a lot of these players, you take a look at Nick Backstrom, for example, there's more rumblings out there hearing from medical professionals that there's a good chance he may never return to hockey again. That's kind of a scary thought, but that's why we have to have our eyes to the future. Shane Gersich is another one. I'm not really sure what happened to him. A few years ago, it seemed like he was poised to be joining the Washington Capitals, and I thought he was here to stay, and he seemed to kind of lose favor somehow. Let us in a little bit on what went wrong in his career. It seems like something went wrong, because for a while there, it seemed like his trajectory was to be a part of the Washington Capitals. Where did things go wrong with him?
Well, I think it was more of a developmental step. And I think he really did take a big step forward this past season in a lot of ways. I think the, ups and downs of the COVID season, I would have liked to see him get a shot there at some point, just because I think his game's been steadily improving, but not in leaps and bounds, quite like you've seen some of these other guys. Like, I know we've seen Brett Leeson kind of go up and make an immediate impact there and, get his first goal. And, I agree with you. I think that Gersich seemed like he was poised to, almost skip Hershey entirely at one point there towards the time the Capitals were winning the Stanley Cup and things along that line. And he came to Hershey and kind of never really got that opportunity. But, you know, to his credit, I think that Washington wanted him to be a, depth scorer type of thing. I think they saw that spinorama goal he had in college and some of those bigger, plays that he made in those times. Whereas in Hershey, he's really been just a strong two-way guy. I mean, he, kills penalties, very strong two ways. Didn't have an explosive offensive season in my mind that, the likes of Brian Pinho, you even look at guys like Connor McMichael that, kind of came down here and found success. And, Pinho is a guy that had a 20-goal season. And, that really opened the Capitals' eyes towards him. He made the playoff team later on in the bubble, trying to make an impact there. Just didn't seem like Gersich grabbed their eyes quite like some of those guys have over the years. And, it's a shame because I'd like to see him get one more year. I mean, he shattered his career numbers in the AHL this past season. He was a really key player. I would say probably from, December through a good chunk of February there. He was potting goals and, finding a lot of success. And it did taper off a little bit there towards, February, March, and later stages in April when the Bears were really having some of those personnel issues. But it seemed like, for a little bit, you saw the flashes of that guy that I think the Capitals were looking for, and it just didn't quite come about that way. And he just didn't get that opportunity. I'm not sure if they were looking for a certain role with him, maybe, or, there's something more than meets the eye there a little bit. But it's a shame, really, because I think he's been growing really well. I'd love to see him get another contract to try to see if he can't work his way up to that kind of role there for sure.
Yeah, because he is an unrestricted free agent. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, both him and Brian Pinho are among the key players alongside Phoenix Copley for Hershey that are unrestricted this summer for sure.
And Gersich played college hockey in North Dakota, if memory serves, right? Yeah, that's that hockey factory out there. All right, so after the break here, we are going to continue to talk with Corey Swartz. We're going to talk about what players he thinks are going to be ready for prime time next year and who is going to fill in for Tom Wilson. We'll talk about that next. All right, welcome back to this edition of Locked On Capitals. In this edition, I'm joined with Corey Swartz as we're talking a little Hershey Bears and Washington Capitals. So let's start there. What player on the Hershey Bears roster, as we know, Tom Wilson, the best case scenario, won't be back until December. If they call on Hershey, what player do you think is ready to fill that role?
Well, I got two names for you, and they were both signed to new contracts last week. Brett Leeson, Beck Mallenstein. Leeson is a guy in my mind that they'll probably go to first, at least. They seem to like him for a similar body type, being a big-bodied right winger type of thing, even though he hasn't filled in necessarily one-to-one for Tom Wilson. But when Wilson's been out, they seem to have gone to him. But I also like Beck Mallenstein because he plays a more similar style of hockey to Wilson's, where it's a real in-your-face, hard-hitting, heavy kind of game that, I think he's found a lot of success. Obviously, I don't think he was called upon as much. I know he was up in the NHL level for a little bit last season, but he was coming off of an injury and a surgery that really, it wiped out an entire season for him, which is why he's he needed a new contract this year and not last year. That was allowed to roll over, I think, because of missing that full season. But he's a guy in my mind that he just plays that similar style. He gets to the dirty areas. He pots a lot of rebounds, deflections, those types of goals. He has that upside. I think that, he's still working on getting a lot out of. And Leeson's a guy where, he only gets better, I think, really. Crash the crease guy, big body. He's also got a very deceptively good shot in my mind as well that he's been working on in his time in Hershey. And, hey, he scored that huge goal for the Bears during their, short-lived playoff round against Wilkes-Barre where they completed that dramatic comeback to tie that game late And, fortunately the overtime didn't go Hershey's way, but, he's a guy where I think that if you have a complete Hershey Bears lineup, which of course we really didn't have a lot last year, he's one of those guys where he thrives in those situations. He's, one of those guys you want to have on the ice in the key roles there. So, I think if, it's almost like if you took Tom Wilson and split him into two players, I think, you get a Beck Mallenstein and a Brett Leeson. Neither of them can replace Tom Wilson fully just because he's such a unique player and, beloved in the Capitals organization for good reason. But they're guys that bring a lot of his elements. And, I remember when Beck Mallenstein was younger, they said they remind him of a young Tom Wilson. So, both those guys have that going for them, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I saw it. There was all these pictures of Tom Wilson. I think that it was recently, like 10 years ago or whatever it was that he's been in the league. And he was a much smaller man back then. I mean, like a lot of these guys, they kind of bulk up and kind of grow into that role. And I mean, if you think about Tom Wilson around the league, he's revered as kind of just like this goon, this tough guy, but he's a legitimate goal scorer, gets 20 plus goals. So those are some big shoes to fill. But going forward here, what players on the Hershey Bears do you think are ready to have their breakout year? They're going to break through and they're going to go past the Bears and they're ready for their big shot on the Washington Capitals. We've talked about, there's Leeson and Protas, Hendricks Lapierre. They all had their opportunity. Of those players, who do you think is poised to have a breakout year?
Well, I think there's two guys that stick out in my mind that, they're kind of there already, but it was, circumstances kind of hampered them a little bit. And those are Joe Snively and Axel Jonsson-Fjällby. Snively, I mean, there were times in Hershey last year where we were saying, all right, looking at your watch, when are the Capitals going to recall Joe Snively? He was phenomenal. It broke my heart to see him go when he did, just because, he was such an integral part to Hershey's success, but, he earned it. He was, head and shoulders. Genuinely, whatever he did between the season prior and last season, keep working on it, man, because he was fantastic. I mean, everything he touched, turned to gold. Every puck that he shot went in. Every opportunity he capitalized on. There were just some plays. I remember in particular one. It was a shorthanded goal he scored on Wilkes-Barre where he stole the puck at his own blue line and just skated in and just left the Penguins in the dust. Never seen the Penguins so far behind, trailing a guy, and just cut in and scored. And it was brilliant. So I think he's been fantastic. And, he was showing flashes of that carrying over to Washington prior to his injury, which, set him back and was disappointing. And, same goes for Axel. I mean, he's a great guy. He's, just like Joe Snively, when both Snively and Axel were recalled, you could just tell the Bears lost that burning speed because the two of them just absolutely bring that. They make everybody faster, really. I had the honor of seeing him score an overtime game-winning goal against Wilkes-Barre in Wilkes-Barre, my first trip up there last season. And, he's just one of those guys. He's all over the place, always wants the puck on his stick. The biggest thing was that he had the speed, but, they were kind of looking for the shot and some of those other skills to kind of catch up for it. And they did, I think, this past season. And, obviously some of the cap restrictions and, using waivers and those sorts of things kind of handcuffed Axel to the bench and, being a black ace, kind of sitting out a little bit in a sense towards the end of the last season. But he's a guy that I think, if you're going to be missing Carl Hagelin for any stretch, which, I think that's kind of up in the air at this point as well. I hope he's okay. But, they're similar players. I'd like to see Axel get a little bit of a higher opportunity just because I think that he's a guy that thrives with a little bit of a higher role and some more ice time. Again, the Capitals are shaping their roster, in a way we haven't seen in a long time this summer. So, I mean, I think there's a good potential that it's going to have a different look to it, but I'd like to see Axel get that shot just because he's had that, so many good breakout opportunities in Hershey that I think that he's earned it in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that it's often said is that this Washington Capitals team needs to get younger. It's a faster league, but they always seem to kind of put that off. And we've talked about many different players tonight that are ready for their chance. They're like, put me in, coach. I'm ready to play. And a lot of the players that we talked about are either on the cusp or are ready to do that. So, Corey, why don't you tell everyone here where we can find your work for our audio listeners here so we can check out your work?
Yeah, absolutely. You can follow me on Twitter at CSWA11 or at HBH Nation blog over on Twitter. A lot of those, I cover both the Bears on both pages there, but HBH Nation's a little bit more Bears central. It's where all the articles will appear at. On my personal, I've been covering the Calder Cup Finals a little bit more, some of the other AHL action that's going around there recently, and you get a good mix on both there for sure. And the website for it is bearshockeynation.wordpress.com, or you'll see my work appear on Field Pass Hockey. I've been contributing a lot for the Springfield Thunderbirds there this spring here on the playoffs there. So that's at FPH Hockey over on Twitter and the website as well for sure.
Yeah, and everyone make sure and check out that webpage I was on there before I was doing this podcast tonight. And there's just a ton of information on the Hershey Bears, what's going on, what big players are coming up. So everyone head on over and check that out. Corey, thank you so much for joining me tonight. You're a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the Hershey Bears and hockey in general. And we'd love to have you on again sometime.
Anytime you'd like to have me, I'd be happy to join you. I had a lot of fun, and I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, thank you once again for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, and I'll talk to you again next time.